I stand before you today not as a man who claims to know the unseen, not as someone who pretends to decode destiny, but as a human being burdened by reflection, history, and responsibility. Because when I read and contemplate the prophecy of Yajuj and Majuj, it does not feel like a distant myth or an ancient warning meant only for the past. It feels like a mirror held up to our present world. And I say this with humility and seriousness, because Islam teaches us that some signs are not meant to satisfy curiosity, they are meant to awaken conscience. And when the Quran and authentic narrations speak about Yajuj and Majuj as a people who will emerge in overwhelming numbers, spreading corruption across the land, draining resources, overwhelming systems, and shaking the balance of the world, I cannot help but ask myself not when they will come, but what kind of world allows such chaos to flourish? Because corruption is not always loud. Sometimes it is systematic. Sometimes it wears the face of progress. Sometimes it hides behind technology, power, greed, and unchecked desire. And when I look at the modern world with its endless consumption, its exploitation of weaker nations, its destruction of nature, its loss of moral restraint, I feel the weight of this prophecy pressing on the conscience of every leader, including myself. Because Islam does not teach us to wait passively for signs. It teaches us to correct ourselves before signs become consequences. And the story of Yajuj and Majuj reminds me that numbers alone do not make a civilization. Great strength without morality becomes destruction. Advancement without accountability becomes corruption. And power without restraint becomes a test that most fail. And I reflect deeply on the moment when Dhul Qarnayn built a barrier not out of arrogance but responsibility. Not to dominate people but to protect humanity from harm. Because leadership in Islam is not about ruling over others. It is about standing between harm and the innocent, even when that responsibility is heavy. And today I ask myself as a leader in this modern era, where are our barriers, not of iron and copper, but of justice, ethics, and self-restraint? Because Yajuj and Majuj in the prophecy are not only a physical force, they represent what happens when restraint collapses and desire becomes law. And this should frighten every nation that believes technology alone will save it. Because no civilization in history collapsed due to lack of intelligence. They collapsed due to lack of character. And Islam warns us that near the end of time, chaos will not come suddenly. It will grow quietly, normalized step by step, until people drink water without thinking of those left thirsty, extract wealth without thinking of those left poor, and dominate lands without thinking of accountability before Allah. And when the prophecy describes Yajuj and Majuj consuming everything in their path, I see a warning against unchecked greed, unchecked expansion, unchecked exploitation, because Allah does not condemn strength, He condemns oppression. And I fear a world where leaders speak of peace while manufacturing destruction, where nations preach human rights while suffocating weaker economies, where progress is measured in profit instead of dignity. Because such a world is not far from the spirit of the prophecy, and Islam teaches us that when corruption becomes widespread and normalized, divine signs follow not to punish blindly but to restore balance. And this is why the prophecy of Yajuj and Majuj should not be used to spread fear, but responsibility, not panic, but preparation, not speculation, but reform. Because the true shock of this prophecy is not their numbers. It is humanity's failure to learn before it is too late. And I speak honestly when I say that every leader should tremble at the idea of standing before Allah while having ignored injustice. Because the day of judgment does not ask how powerful you were, it asks how just you were. And I see in this prophecy a reminder that even the strongest barriers will one day fall if humanity refuses to reform its soul. And when Allah allows Yajuj and Majuj to break free, it will not be because Allah is unaware, it will be because humanity has been warned enough times. And Islam reminds us that ultimate control belongs only to Allah, not to nations, not to armies, not to economies, and this humbles me deeply. Because as a leader, I am reminded that authority is temporary, life is temporary, and accountability is eternal. And if we truly reflect on this prophecy, we should not ask when Yajuj and Majuj will come. We should ask whether our actions resemble the corruption they represent, whether we are building barriers of justice or tearing them down with greed, whether we are protecting the weak or feeding systems that crush them. Because Islam teaches that the end times are not announced with sirens, they unfold through human choices, and the most frightening realization for me is that a world obsessed with domination, consumption, and ego does not need monsters to destroy itself. It does that on its own. And this is why the prophecy of Yajuj and Majuj shook me, not because of fear of them, but because of fear of who we are becoming. And I stand here saying this with sincerity, that the only true protection is not walls, weapons, or wealth. It is justice, humility before Allah, care for humanity, and restraint of desire, because when those collapse, no barrier will hold, and when those are restored, even the greatest threats lose their power. And I pray that we take these warnings seriously, not as entertainment, not as speculation, but as a call to reform ourselves before history repeats itself under a different name. And as I continue this reflection, without pause, without drama, without breaking the seriousness of this thought, I realize that the prophecy of Yajuj and Majuj also exposes a dangerous illusion that modern humanity lives under. The illusion that time is endless and consequences are optional, because we plan economies for decades but forget accountability for eternity, and Islam does not allow such negligence. It repeatedly reminds us that every rise has a fall if humility is lost. And when I look at the way power operates today, how influence spreads without responsibility, how information moves faster than wisdom, I see how easily corruption can multiply without resistance. Because Yajuj and Majuj are described as overwhelming not just lands, but balance itself. And balance is what Allah loves most. Balance between strength and mercy, progress and ethics, authority and humility. And when balance collapses, chaos fills the vacuum. And this is why the prophecy feels less like a future event and more like a warning about trajectories. Because Islam teaches that Allah does not destroy a people until they destroy what is within themselves. And this statement alone should keep leaders awake at night, because it means no enemy is more dangerous than moral decay, no invasion more destructive than injustice normalized. And I ask myself repeatedly, are we teaching our people restraint or obsession, dignity or dominance, service or selfishness, because nations are not judged by how loudly they speak, but by how responsibly they act? And when I imagine the moment described in the narrations where humanity feels helpless before the spread of Yajuj and Majuj, I do not see just physical helplessness. I see moral exhaustion, a world that has exhausted every solution except turning sincerely back to Allah. And that is when relief comes not from weapons or walls, but from divine decree. Because Islam makes it clear that ultimate control never leaves Allah's hands, even when humanity believes it has mastered everything. And this humbles me deeply, because leadership in such a world is not about appearing strong. It is about preparing people morally for times when strength alone will fail. And I feel a responsibility to speak honestly about this, that if we continue to build systems that reward greed, glorify arrogance, and silence conscience, then we should not be shocked when chaos answers, because the Quran is not a book of surprises. It is a book of warnings delivered with mercy. And Yajuj and Majuj are not mentioned to entertain minds, but to discipline hearts, to remind us that when oppression becomes global, consequences also become global. And I fear that many people today mock such prophecies not because they are false, but because they are uncomfortable, because they demand change, restraint, sacrifice, and humility. And those are the hardest currencies in an age addicted to excess. And I say this as a leader who knows that power is seductive, that authority can blind, that applause can silence conscience. And this is why I return again and again to this prophecy, because it strips power of its illusions and reminds us that Allah can humble any system in a moment. And when that happens, titles mean nothing, borders mean nothing, wealth means nothing, only deeds remain. And I do not want to be remembered as someone who spoke of faith while practicing convenience, or warned of corruption while benefiting from it, because Islam does not allow selective morality. It demands consistency even when it is uncomfortable. And the true shock of Yajuj and Majuj is that they expose how fragile civilization becomes when morality is treated as optional. And I believe deeply that if humanity truly understood this prophecy, it would invest less in domination and more in justice, less in image and more in substance, less in control and more in accountability, because the end of times is not a countdown, it is a condition. And conditions are created by choices. And I pray that before the final signs unfold, we correct those choices, because Allah's mercy always comes before His judgment. But mercy is not endless for those who refuse to change. And as I continue to reflect on this without stopping, without softening the message, I say clearly, that the greatest protection against any future chaos is not fear but reform, not panic but repentance, not speculation but action. Because Islam teaches us that even in the darkest prophecies, there is guidance for those willing to listen, and I want to be among those leaders who listened before it was too late, who acted before warnings turned into consequences, who remembered that power is a test, time is short, and accountability before Allah is absolute and unavoidable. And as this thought flows forward, without interruption, I find myself confronting another uncomfortable truth that the prophecy of Yajuj and Majuj places before us, which is that humanity often mistakes delay for approval, and Islam warns us clearly that Allah's patience is not ignorance and His delay is not weakness, because when corruption spreads and is left unchallenged, it does not disappear, it matures, it organizes, and it overwhelms. And that is exactly how the narrations describe Yajuj and Majuj, not as a sudden accident, but as a force released at a moment when humanity has already failed to restrain itself. And this realization forces me to look inward as a leader and ask whether I'm contributing to restraint or to delay, whether I am challenging injustice or simply managing it, because there is a difference between governing and guiding, and Islam places guidance above control. And when the Quran speaks about people who spread corruption while claiming to bring reform, it becomes impossible not to see parallels with our time, where exploitation is dressed as development, and domination is justified as stability. And I say this with a heavy heart because the prophecy does not condemn one nation or one people. It condemns a pattern of behavior that can infect any civilization that forgets Allah, forgets accountability, and forgets the value of human dignity. And when I imagine the overwhelming numbers of Yajuj and Majuj described in the narrations, I do not only imagine bodies, I imagine systems multiplying, injustices replicating, greed scaling faster than conscience, until the world feels suffocated not by enemies but by its own excesses. And Islam teaches us that when humanity reaches that point, sincere dua becomes the final refuge, not because Allah abandoned humanity, but because humanity abandoned the guidance it was given. And this terrifies me more than any physical threat, because it means that knowledge alone is not salvation, power alone is not protection, and intelligence alone is not wisdom. And this is why the prophecy shakes me deeply, because it strips away every false sense of security and leaves only one question standing: what have you done with the trust given to you? And I reflect on the fact that Dhul Qarnayn did not take credit for the barrier he built. He attributed success to Allah, acknowledging that even the strongest structures are temporary by Allah's will, and that humility is the difference between protection and arrogance. And I fear a world where leaders build barriers of pride instead of barriers of justice, because pride collapses and justice endures. And Islam teaches that when Yajuj and Majuj are finally released, even the right EUs will feel fear, not because they were corrupt, but because they understand the weight of divine decree. And that teaches us something powerful, that faith does not make a person careless. It makes them cautious, responsible, and alert. And I want to live and lead with that alertness, not numbed by routine, not distracted by titles, not intoxicated by power, because the greatest tragedy would be to recognize the signs and still refuse to change. And I say openly that if the prophecy of Yajuj and Majuj only makes us curious about the future and not concerned about our present, then we have misunderstood it entirely, because Islam does not teach fear without purpose. It teaches fear that produces reform, humility, and justice. And as this reflection continues, uninterrupted, I feel a growing conviction that the real barrier we must build today is within ourselves, against greed, against oppression, against moral laziness, because once those barriers fall, no external defense will matter. And I pray sincerely that Allah allows us to learn from warnings rather than from collapse, from reflection rather than from regret, and that before the world reaches a point where chaos becomes unstoppable, we return collectively to justice, restraint, and accountability, because when humanity aligns itself with what Allah loves, even the most frightening prophecies become lessons rather than destinies. And this is the hope I hold on to as I continue speaking without pause, without embellishment, without fear-mongering, only with sincerity, that it is never too late to reform until the final decree arrives. And when that decree comes, no voice will be louder than truth, no power greater than Allah's will, and no regret heavier than the realization that we were warned and chose comfort over change.